My kid was watching YouTube videos the other day. Not mine, not ours. I don't think he's our audience, but he was watching Critical Role, the podcast about playing Dungeons and Dragons. And yeah, it got me thinking about the topic that we're going to be talking about today, because when you play Dungeons and Dragons, it's kind of a collective group of people developing a shared narrative, a shared
Yeah.
story. Everyone's contributing a little bit, and then you have the dungeon master who's kind of pulling it all together. But really, the whole becomes more than the sum of the parts as a storytelling mechanism through Dungeons and Dragons, because you also have the chance of the roll of the die and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I thought it was an interesting podcast, and I thought it was applicable to what we're going to talk about today, Joda.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I've never really watched the show. I think but I've heard about it, and I just think it's such a neat idea. When someone told me, because I have some friends at work that are really heavily into Dungeons and Dragons, and they talk about the show, and it just
It's a
sounds like
long it's a long podcast. It's like 4 hours,
they
right?
just sit there and they play a whole what's it called they go through a whole dungeon run,
Campaign, a module, right, or
a
whatever. Yeah.
module, and the fact that they hire
Th-
these guys and women who got like who are these voice actors and and are able to sort of apply this sort of these acting chops to this game. I don't know. It's a really interesting. I think it's fascinating.
No, I love it. I love the idea. I haven't listened to it. I probably don't have 4 hours to listen to a podcast, but I think it's really interesting, and I think it is applicable to what we're talking about today. And so what we're going to talk about today, Joda, is Weick and his idea of the sense making organization. And this was really inspired by running across some articles that were published in 2019 in the nonprofit quarterly by Cyndi Suarez, where she does a series of four articles on what a sense making organization is. And I kind of found it fascinating. And I had studied Vike a little bit in my dissertation process, which was on crisis management and leadership. So he came up there, and especially in terms of the concept around sense making. And since this is a sense making podcast, or a podcast that is exploring sense making, we have to address Vike, because he's kind of one of the critical players in the development of that concept. And what I think, you know, I I was drawn to was the concept of the sense making organization being like a jazz band, and it embracing a sense of improvisation. And we both, Joda, you and I both have arts backgrounds. You're a musician. I come from theater and writing, and so that's definitely appealing. And trying to that metaphor of the arts is very appealing to in trying to conceptualize what a sense making organization is. Um, and so, what I'm hoping to cover today is, why this conversation is important right now, why we should be talking about sense making organizations at this particular moment, and what are the characteristics of a sense making organization. How can you look around your organization to see, is my organization a sense making one, and if not, how can I make it one, if that's what I think it should be. And then, how is a sense making organization like a jazz band? What does that metaphor really mean? And how can we use that to better actualize our organizations into becoming sense making organizations? Then, what are the benefits of this framework for thinking about our organizations, and what are the dangers? And then finally, what can you do as an employee or a leader or someone within an organization? Because an organization can be anything from a family unit to a multinational corporation, right? So, what can you do to cultivate more sense making in your organization? So, those are some of the topics that I'm hoping we dig into today, Joda, as we talk about Karl Weick and his sense making organization framework.
I did not know we were going to talk about that. Okay, but that sounds very interesting. So I'm
I threw
really
you a curveball.
curious where this is gonna go. Hey, well, hey, welcome everybody. I want to welcome everybody to Sense and Signal podcast with Jodah and Dan. We're here to discuss organizational leadership and sense making. Make sure you tap the like button and leave a comment to join, or excuse me, a comment to join in the conversation. Yeah, Dan. So you threw a lot out there.
Did.
Yeah,
It's
it's
a
like
big transition
I
from Critical Role podcast to sense-making organizations.
I feel like perhaps you gave an outline for 5 separate podcasts, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
And that's a new
So
idea, like, we could do how Dungeons& and Dragons is a sense-making organization when you're
yeah,
playing together.
yeah. All right. So
We won't go there.
we've got this concept called sense making, and and before we dive into that, Dan, can you kind of give us an outline view of why what kind of environment are we talking that this whole sense making thing matters? Why are we even talking about sense making in the first place?
Yeah, so I think Weick, who's one of the leading scholars on sense making and organizational sense making. He's a professor at the University of Michigan. He's been writing and researching and publishing on this since the 1950s. He's been doing, and he's still alive. He's still, I think, somewhat active. Um, and as he says, we live in a complex world, and this whole episode could be a sequel to our complexity podcast episode a few episodes ago. We live in a very complex environment where there are a lot of variables taking place at the same time to create a lot of ambiguity in our world and in our organizations, especially during this post COVID time, or what I'm calling this late COVID era time, where um, there's still, we've gone through 2 years of COVID and all the other things that have happened over the past 2 or 3 years that have made our lives much more complex, or made us recognize how our world is much more complex than we probably um, have ever thought before. And what a complex organization really is, or complexity really is, it has some characteristics like high levels of ambiguity and uncertainty. We've definitely seen that over the last 4 or 5 years. A recognition of interconnectedness, and how one part of a system can deeply impact another part of a system, and sometimes in ways that you can't see until it happens. And so we've seen, with the pandemic, supply chain issues, uh, issues with our healthcare system, um, breakdown in sense making on the internet. All these different ways we see just this really challenging world to navigate. So the reason we need to have this discussion is we need to help our organizations navigate this new type of environment, or this increasingly complex environment that we find ourselves living in. And yeah, and I think it will help the people in our organizations thrive, and help our organizations thrive, if they become better at sense making in a increasingly complex and ambiguous world.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and if he wrote this stuff, I mean, he came up with these theories, if I remember correctly, in the 60s, right? So these aren't necessarily a response of recent calamities that have
No.
occurred in our societies. And he has, and he's identified something. He's framing this, and maybe other people have as well. This stage in our in the uh, organizational arena as the post-industrial organization, which I don't know the specifics of what a pre-industrial. Although in my head I can probably kind of assume what a pre-industrial organization was, but it's he coined this probably in the 60s, so everything was post in the
Well, yeah,
60s,
I
right?
mean, you have these industrial organizations starting to rise in the late 1900s, with corporations and bigger, more complex business models. And I could see him even in the 60s, and once again, uh, well, I'm kind of projecting this onto him, so I can't say that he's actually written this, but I could see a lot of theorists and organizational theory and leadership being able to predict that organizations were just going to get more complex as time moved on into the 21st century. I know with transformational leadership theory, for instance, one of the reasons that was cultivated was because people we're seeing that things were only growing more complex, and that when you kind of project that out into the 21st century, you can see more complexity emerging, and I don't see that train stopping. I think the world is just going to get more and more complex, and we've got to learn how to navigate that complexity.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to sort of understand like the what we're meaning by complex in certain ways. And there's a lot of discussion one can have on that. In this particular conversation, again for Karl Weick, I believe that's how we pronounce it, Weick.
Like like
And you already kind of mentioned this this is typified. This post-industrial organization is typified through that where the classic causal relationships become increasingly less clear, which is really interesting,
yes.
and leadership structures become increasingly less relevant, which is also very interesting, which then either those states either create or are responses to a constant state of uncertainty. And so and I think we in the modern sort of information field at the very least can attest to that sort of uncertainty layer that's always sort of there now these days. And so what Vike is saying is like, let's acknowledge that reality. And so the original thinking of how systems or how organizations were were perceived or what they were supposed to do needs to switch, needs to change. And he sort of states this in some way, you know. So
Yeah, I think he's saying like the what we would call a rational system, right? Back in the mid 20th century, where everything was focused on a hierarchy and what's your role within that hierarchy and what's your function and what are the goals that you're supposed to achieve. That's a very rigid structure. And I think with a sense making organization, he's arguing to move away from that structure is ineffective in an increasingly complex world, and you have to create organizations that are more sense making and focused and nimble and able to respond and improvise the responses to a changing environment.
Yeah, and I like the fact that he says he calls post-industrial organizations as rationales for commitment,
Huh,
where
yeah.
things are oriented around the individual's cognitive processes. I thought about that rationales for commitment, and I think as we go deeper into the conversation, it starts to kind of become clear why he says that. But on the surface, it reads like he's saying that as an organization is a commitment to do something, and that you are developing or rationalizing those behaviors to fulfill that commitment. And quote in quote rationalization can be can be kind of a self-defined here. What do we mean by rational?
Yeah,
But
that's a
that's
whole different episode, I think. Yeah.
yeah, but it's well, no, he goes into it a little bit, you know, and I think it's interesting, you know. And so, hey, so Dan, so yes, the world is crazy. The world is increasingly becoming what more fragmented, or the organization is becoming more fragmented. Let's say we all agree that there's increasing uncertainty in the organization, and I don't necessarily mean uncertainty about security of your position, although that's part of it. I mean uncertainty into not knowing what the variables are in your organization, uncertainty around who's technically the boss or not the boss. Does it matter if there's a boss? Uncertainty around what your goals are. So that kind of uncertainty because of the way the structures are that would be qualified as post-industrial. You then state that he states that it's solved through this sense making thing. What is this sense making thing?
Yeah. So I've got a definition that I'm working on, and I'm going to kind of unpack that for you. So for me, a sense making and I want to caveat that this is a definition of a sense making organization, not necessarily sense making itself, right? But we're talking today about organizations and how organizations can collectively engage in sense making. So a sense making organization engages in iterative discussions with itself. So it's an organization that has conversations with itself over time. So it's an iterative process. It's not a one and done conversation. It's over time, and that's ultimately what meetings are for. Why we get together and engage in chats, hallway conversations, formalized meetings. Uh, Announcements to the organization from the hierarchy, things like that. So how are the different what are the different ways the organization is having iterative conversations with itself to develop meaning around what it's doing and what's impacting the organization. So that would be one feature. It draws on experience and data to develop a plausible explanation of an ambiguous phenomena. So, like, if there's a lot of ambiguity in the environment, there's a lot of variables impacting um, your that might be impacting something that you're trying to understand. you know um you're looking at past experience and drawing on past experience to kind of make sense of it, or the group is, because once again this is about collective sense making. Members of a group in an organization, could be a department, it could be people from multiple departments coming together in a meeting to make sense of something. And then you're trying to make sense of it, you're trying to make meaning out of what's going on based on what data you have and your past experience. And then the focus of sense making, whether you're talking about sense making individually or sense making as a collective, is always about action. What do you do? How is the understanding that you're developing going to inform your response to the environment, or the problem that you're facing or the situation you're trying to address? And then, I think one detail I really appreciate is that sense making should produce what Weick calls rich information. And rich information is characterized by the fact that it's easily communicated, uh, and it changes people's perceptions about an ambiguous situation in a timely manner. So it will produce, if done effectively, it will produce information that can help you respond to an ambiguous situation through communicating to everyone within the organization about what's going on. And um and will it'll effectively provide enough information to change their perceptions, and then they'll be able to respond in a timely manner. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, or some of the salient features of a sense making organization that uh jump out at me. What about you, Joda?
Hey, Dan, I'm sorry, man. Your mic turned off there. Can you say that again? I'm just kidding, man. No, we got it. So I'm gonna say that. Damn it.
Every one of those episodes. Thanks,
Where
thank God somebody's bringing some levity to this crap.
that's an old joke I run all the time. Never gets old. Um, No, that sounds I don't really that's what I mean, it sounds good to me. I mean, it's like I said, I'm kind of new to the subject, so but from what I've read, that seems to align with what I've taken in thus far. What I like to though sort of also sort of highlight here is like a lot of people listening to this are like that's that's a lot of what they feel like they should be doing already or are doing already on some level, right?
Right.
And what I'd like to say is that he has a high level distinction that he's trying to make, and for a lot of us we're already kind of living to some degree, if not informally, what he's discussing.
Yeah,
we're
for sure.
we're
I can.
we're in there's implied realities there that we haven't explicitly stated in our company's approaches to doing business internally, but they've just sort of been adopted through them. I would say the agile process, for those who are in software,
Yeah.
very very
A lot of what
familiar.
he talks about reminds me of Agile.
And it does. And so, but I do want to make the distinction. It's like, so where are we coming from? Like, what is it that we're at? And because a lot of us might not even recognize this thing. Because remember, he wrote this in the 60s, again, I think. And
Well, he's
that
been writing from the 60s all the way to
my point is that
aughts,
this
right?
idea, though, this initiation of the sense making of this definition of the post, was it the not the postmodern, the post industrial space. But is that the before the post-industrial organization, it was in where he's saying that it should be framed in a sense-making model. There was he's saying that it was more organizations were more seen as uh, uh, um, associated with making decisions, decision
Mm,
makers. That
yeah.
you were meant that every role was seen as some level of a decision maker, where uh in this sense making space it's less about that and it's more about making sense, actually generating a state of sense and actually making meaning. And so as a leader you're actually not making decisions, you're making meaning. And we'll get into a little more of that as we start to dive into this other aspect that we want to talk about, which has to do with jazz. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
kind of the distinction I want to make with people's like, where are we? Why? What are we now? Because where is he coming from? And you can see that in the old style movies, right? Where the boss comes in and Smith, what's going on? What do you got for me now? And it's like I
Yeah.
did this, and here's my TPS report. Where in this modern world, they're saying that's just not satisfactory. You're not going to succeed by kind of sticking to that model. So, anyways.
Yeah, it doesn't allow for enough flexibility and uh improvisation is what we're which is what we're segueing to now, right? The idea of the sense making organization being like a jazz band. And that's kind of a more flattened out hierarchy, right? Like, so those old organizations you were just describing, mid 20th century corporations where the hierarchy was very rigid, um was a model that maybe obviously worked at that period of time. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. But our times have changed, and that model just does not work anymore. So, what I see him arguing for is us developing a mentality where we are developing jazz bands. And I was watching a movie today, Breathless by Jean Luc Godard, and it's kind of a French New Wave film. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's a foundational film for the French New Wave, but it's very jazz influenced. And one critic I was watching after I watched the film was talking about a good definition of jazz is that you have an underlying structure, right? You have a tone or a melody that's kind of holding everything together. And then people are riffing off of that and improvising off of that base structure. And that's kind of what creates this jazziness. So you can't have one without the other. Nothing emerges out of nothing. Everything is built off of that. And in order to, off of some structure, and in order to be able to improvise like that, you need a team that has practiced together, that is comfortable playing that jazz together, that listens very closely to what each other is saying, that has a good memory about what has come before, so that they can build off the riffs that the other musicians are putting out there. I mean, Jodah, you're a jazz musician. I mean, where you're a piano player, and I know you play some jazz. So when you think about an organization as, or a sense making organization as a jazz band, what are some characteristics that appeal to or that speak to you with that metaphor?
So I'm going to try to bring it to bridge that gap to the organization. And I think, I've been thinking about this subject matter, like what's it mean to me? Because like I said, I feel that there are already aspects to it that I either um, have fostered internally or have evangelized internally or have been upset because it hasn't happened internally.
Yeah,
Um, but as the model that Vike is talking about in its relationship to let's say jazz in a jazz band, um, he has this concept called bounded rationality, right? And that's true for a jazz band as well. And what he means by bounded rationality is that everybody kind of comes into this with a rationale, but it's bounded, right? And again, these are obvious terms, like what you know, right? You only know what you
right.
know. And so that Dan comes in with his bounded rationality and Jodah comes in with his bounded rationality. And why this is important is that because we are beings of rationality. We rationalize things. So we only know what we know. And so the information we have is, our we all have changing memories, we have short attention spans, we all, and it's different. My attention span is different from Dan's. What Dan notices of a painting will be different what I notice of a painting, right? And so we need to then come together and work together, right? And so there's the rub, right? We're different. And that's where this sort of creation of meaning is important. And that's where management comes into play, is in generation meaning, so that Dan and I can get behind a storyline, right? A theme,
Hmm.
something. And jazz would be a chord progression or something like that. And we can get behind that, but then we bring our own expertise into that sort of storyline and are able to create, well, he uses all, I'm gonna just make terms, motifs or embellishments or variations or versions, and work with each other. The more we work with each other, the more we actually start developing our own relationship, our own language, our own code language, which starts to probably get tighter knit, which is probably a little antithetical to what he's saying. But I think what's one of the interesting things, like I said, to your question, is that I think there is this notion that as a jazz band, you're all coming in with your own special, unique thoughts and notions, and the outset they might even be contradictory, right? And
Hmm.
somehow there needs to be a meaning. And for a jazz band, it's, hey, we're coming together to do a four-piece band, and here's our charts, and these charts have some songs we're going to play today. Doesn't mean we're going to play them exactly the way they were played on the radio or the record, but this is the meaning. This is what the theme we're going with. And so I think there's something to be had there. That's kind of the key thing, that we have individual expertise coming together under a moniker of a single notion of meaning.
Yeah, I love that description, Joda, and I really appreciate what I get out of that. Again, is the important, what I took away from what you just said is made me reflect on the role of a leader. And in an organization, or a sense making organization, and that in a sense we're helping our employees and our staff and our other leaders within the organization make meaning of our work and make help we're helping them to understand what we're doing. Um and then, those things that, you know maybe the old rational systems organizations might have been concerned with, like goals and productivity, that will come out of that will be born out of the meaning making that the collective
That's the
does.
theory,
uh,
right? That's the theory.
yeah.
I mean, that's right. Yeah.
And so and so yeah, because I think as human beings, we're motivated by meaning, and we've discussed this, Joda, where what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? Is it to be happy, or is it to construct meaning and having purpose and meaning to your life? And I think for a lot of people, it is about having some meaning. And I think, people spend about 70% of their lives in the workplace. So they want it to be a meaningful experience. And the more you can bring people together to collaborate on that meaning making and recognize that it is important to bring people from different areas of the organization together to build that meaning, because they are going to each bring their own expertise, and they're also all playing a different part in the band, right? Who's the trumpet player? Who's the saxophonist? Who's the percussionist? Who's the vocalist, right? And how are they going? How are you going to get them to sync up so that they're all playing harmoniously together? And yeah, so I'm definitely into that, and I find it's something I definitely embrace and try to pursue as a leader myself within my organization.
Yeah, he even says that you should be designing for that instead of planning, you should be designing for ambiguity, right? Your approaches should be throwing in systems that not only recognize, perhaps even celebrate the ambiguity. Whoa, I don't know. That's probably weird. That's probably a little too hippy dippy. But I mean, God forbid, right? I mean, you actually are saying you embrace the ambiguity, and I'm not exactly sure what that means exactly right now. But I think if we go when we go a little deeper into some of what it means to be a jazz band, I think we can kind of identify what that means, and what you lose through that as well. There's gains and losses to that, right?
Yeah,
Obviously.
for sure.
But he says that, yeah, instead of like focusing on plan, which I'm not going to say that you throw out your plans. I don't think you. I'm a big planner. I like plans, but I
Oh
think
no, I don't think it's saying to throw out plans. I
they
mean,
have a
that's
time and a
kind of like
place.
that. Well, I would say a plan is that melody that's underlying the improvisation, right? That you don't develop a plan so that it's so rigid that you can't respond and adapt to changing situations or new information. You want to build the plan almost like a loosely coupled system, right? So here's what our plan is, and now we have all these other people who are coming to the table to participate in executing this plan. They're going to bring some variations to how it materializes, and
Yeah.
that's a good thing. We don't have to be like a command and control model organization.
Right. Yeah. And you know what's also something he says that I've said a thousand, well, not a thousand times, but quite a bit. Um,
Maybe a
but
thousand.
yeah, yeah, yeah. From the my interpretation is that he says these man a good leader, right? He's using the term manager, but let's just say a leader, right? And a leader can come from any direction. And I think in the spirit of what he's writing about the ambiguity, I think it's even more prevalent that a leader can be coming from any direction, from below, from the top. But any
Yes.
leader who the leader should help set this meaning, and or ergo, or aka a story. What's the story? What's the story? What's our point? And but it, Mike says, despite the fact if it's actually based on, what's the word he uses, like real data from internal
Reliable.
reliable information, like it could be presumed and even inaccurate, the meaning that the leader is saying, but that's okay, right? Like people are listening, like, wait, they could be wrong, like they have the wrong perception of the meaning of the work they're be doing. He says, because again, we're in a sense making world. The definition is it's by action. So you need to create a story to get people moving, to move forward, because
Yeah.
now you're moving. All right, well, now you're making mistakes. Right, it's true, you are making mistakes, but with your blinders off, so you're taking signals in. After you've done your action and you get information, your signals back, that's where sense making comes into play. You're going to now sit back and capture these signals and use your sense making apparatus to analyze what's happening, because sense making is backward thinking, where creation is forward thinking. And he's saying that although you do create to move forward, you've got to leverage that sense making capability on backwards. And that's where the meat is. That's where you're going to find out, if you're doing the right thing. And then you do action again. So I love the idea that he says it almost doesn't matter if your initial decisions are right or wrong. Just start moving. In fact,
Yeah.
I heard an artist the other day say, he said, God, what did he say? Uh, he said, wow, what did he say? He said, like, create something all the time, daily, even if like, oh, that's what he said. Even if you are not enjoying it, continue to do, because
Oh
eventually
yeah.
you through that process, you're gonna start gaining feedback and information that's gonna make you better at what you do. So
Well, and I think that's true in life, and I think in one of the articles we read, like someone said, like, I mean, I think it was the jazz article, that in some ways the principles here are also principles you can use just to live your life too, right? And I would say that point the artist made as a writer, that speaks to me. I've been working on some long form stuff, and I've been on vacation the last week or so, and I get up and I spend 8 a.m. to 12 writing nonstop. And I hate it sometimes. I don't want to do it, but I'm like, all right, I have my cup of coffee. I'm going to do it. And getting back to that sense making aspect of action and then reflection, right? That also speaks to this too, right? Like if you're a writer or you're an artist and you have to take the act of creation. You have to create something like writing or writing a song or making a film, whatever it might be, and then you watch what you've done and say, oh, here are some signals that about things I might want to adjust or change, and that gives me more information for going through that iterative sense making process that we've been talking about. And yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you brought up that from Weick's point of view, sense making is a reflective process, and that it kind of ties in to the Cynefin framework that we talked about a
yeah,
few episodes back with David Snowden. And I'm
totally.
thinking within Cynefin, that where he talks about the complex domain of his Cynefin framework. And he recommends when you're in a place of complexity, what you have to do is do safe to fail probes. And that's what I think Vike's getting at too, is that you have to, for a sense making organization has to be willing to put out, to take actions and treat those actions like probe. It could be a product, it could be a program. It's not going to destroy everything if it doesn't work out. So you're not taking a lot of risk, but you're getting information back from as you put that out into the environment and see the response. That's going to provide you some information back, and then you can make some decisions based on that. And that's really an important part of the sense making process. And that gets back to the listening aspect, right? With the jazz band
Yeah.
metaphor, the jazz folks are, they're playing their music, they're listening to each other, they're listening to the audience and seeing how the audience is responding, and it becomes this kind of feedback loop between the artist and the audience, and the melodies that are emerging.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting what you just described is kind of like what you and I are doing right now with this podcast, right? We are
Yep.
we're sort of fishing. We're throwing we're putting some bait on the end of our pole, and we're throwing out in the water, and we're seeing what our audience might bite onto, what's interesting to them, how best that we can put on this bait, or what pools are are most relevant to this conversation or these conversations, and so we're doing this, and we're doing it in a way so that we don't break our bank or our backs by having to overwork ourselves every week, but we're also making sure that we keep it interesting and viable. And so, yeah, I can relate to everything you just said personally.
Yeah, 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 and I'm sure in other aspects of your life as well. Um, and I think there are benefits and drawbacks to trying to develop a sense making organization. And you're if you're listening to this, you're probably involved in some sort of organization. As I said earlier in the podcast, you could look at an organization as anything from a family unit to a multinational corporation, right? So when we're talking about organizations, we're talking nonprofits, we're talking government organizations, businesses, corporations, you name it. It's kind of
Yeah.
a blanket term. Um, and that, some things I think that some of benefits of it, well, so me backtrack a little bit. So I've kind of extended that umbrella for what an organization is, at least for our podcast. So you might be looking around at your organization and going, well, it's not quite a sense making organization, or oh, this is a sense making organization. And how can I engage in the sense making no matter what part of the spectrum I see my organization is in, right? So it might not be engaging in any sense making, and you might see it engaging in deep sense making. So I think one thing to think about is, what are the benefits and the dangers of a sense making organization if you choose to go that route? Um, and I think one of the things that it embraces complexity is one of the benefits, because we do live in a complex world and a complex reality, and it embraces that. It's not denying the complexity of our existence, and the environment that the organization is operating within. It emphasizes the iterative process of developing understanding and meaning. So it's not a one and done thing. You have to set up you as a leader, you have to be setting up systems and processes for the people in your organization to be able to engage in sense making collectively in groups. And so it forces you to start thinking about that. How are the people in my organization making meaning, and how can we make sure that it's an iterative growing process? And then also, I like the fact that it also recognizes that there might be many different versions of your organization, based on where people are coming from within the organization. So, for instance, I work at a college, so I'm just going to say, like, I can see where faculty see the organization as one thing, whereas the facilities crew might see the organization as completely different than how the faculty view it, because they're coming from two different places. And administrative services, or the grant writing department, or the student services departments, they might see the organization very, very differently from their vantage point. So also being able to bring that diversity of perspective together, and incorporating them all those different viewpoints into the sense making process is really vital. Um, so yeah, and then I think finally the last benefit is I think it forces the organization to constantly question what its value proposition is. We kind of talked about that a couple podcasts ago with Why Ask Why. What is the value of your organization and what you're doing? And I think it's something that's an iterative conversation. You should be constantly asking, what's the value of what I'm offering? So those are some of the benefits. And I think, of course, the dangers are when you're engaging in any kind of sense making. Bias entering the conversation, confirmation bias, or other biases that people might be bringing to the table. And I think you have to just be aware of that and acknowledge the potential for bias emerging or entering the sense making and meaning making process. But overall, I think I only see benefits to embracing the sense making framework. What about you, Joda?
You know me. I don't see things as
You're
cut and
skeptical.
I'm not skeptical. It's not about skeptical. It's just about domains. I think
Yeah.
that I think in the world, I don't think it's either or. Let me put it that way. And
All right.
I don't think that Public Vike would either say was either or either. I think there's a time and place for all sorts of flavors of wine.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
but I think that there is a lot of
Except for
value.
Merlot. There's never time for Merlot.
Yeah, well, so says the movie 20 years ago. So I think that the value of sense making is generally applicable to all processes in an organization. Um, for the most part, I think that there's a couple things that are interesting about it that people should kind of take notice and recognize. One of which is that Vike makes a note that action tends to confirm preconception, so that your preconception actually shapes what is considered worth noting or actionable. So that means you're pre-lensing stuff. So one could say that's called confirmation bias, but it's even maybe a little more problematic than that, because what it does is like the act of looking at something and then saying I'm interested in that might actually dissuade you from other things that are also just as plausible, or maybe even
Yeah.
more plausible. And so knowing that it's important to know that your where you decide to focus your attentions is what's also going to define yourselves in the future, and that you could define yourself in other ways as well as, or in broader ways, if you can get I don't, in other mechanisms. So that's one thing, is the confirmation bias.
No,
um
I want to tap into that because as you say that, I find myself heartily agreeing with that because I personally see that all the time potentially in sense making processes, especially from people who think that they're looking at things through certain lenses and they're contributing something that they think is beneficial socially by using those lenses. But sometimes when you're overusing certain lenses and you're not looking at a situation through multiple lenses, you're liable to have some blind spots. And I guess that also really emphasis brings us back to the diversity aspect and
it's too
bringing
it becomes
diverse
too
perspectives.
it becomes too reductionist potentially, right?
Yeah.
They can reduce, like,
Yes.
all the world's a hammer, and so if you lens something by your attention only, which again, what else are you going to lens by? And all that is just that warning, is that you're a human being, you're lensing it, you're seeing through your goggles, and that shapes reality functionally. And when we say here in this particular situation, it shapes the reality of the organization, and that's just one flavor of reality, though, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. And there might actually be a better reality, that if another lens was actually the one that was driving that particular thing. Not to put any insecurities in anybody. You should be confident in your thoughts and your thinking, but just know that there's this bias. Another thing which is kind of related to that, is the fact that uh, he emphasizes that you shouldn't put too. It's a balance of the past towards the future. The past can only do so much to predict the future. And so
Right.
that it's important that you recognize that balance as well. That yes, you've got all this data, but that was then. and the future's, and so you want more leading indicators as well, right? Because those would be your trailing. I think I'm using that terminology correctly.
Yeah.
And so it's important that you understand that balance, that you don't lean too heavily on the past. So that's another area that, it's not a warning. It's just, just you got to be aware of that.
Yeah, there always should be a healthy amount of uncertainty, right? I tend to see bias when people have absolute certainty in what they're saying, right?
Yeah.
And so have some humility that your perceptions might not always be accurate, or your reading of a situation is not always going to be, you know, 100% accurate. And he kind of says that too in this framework, right? You're trying to figure out the most plausible explanation for what's occurring or what has occurred, not necessarily the most accurate, because you
Right.
might not ever have enough data to determine that.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
And you and I
and
discussed that
so
again in a previous conversation in a different sort of context.
Yeah, I mean, we should always be humble in the face of reality, because reality is incredibly complex, and certainty is a danger. Absolute certainty is a danger.
Yeah.
You should always have be cautious there.
Yeah.
So if you're wanting to move your organization into this sense making terrain, there's some things that you can think about to move your organization forward into becoming more of a sense making organization, or if you want to just bolster the sense making that's already going on in your organization. One is really develop a culture of meaning making, taking the time to really uh, create structures and processes to, whether it might be certain types of meetings, or um, to, but spaces to create meaning generation. Um, Make sure you're, as we've discussed multiple times throughout this episode, foster a diversity of perspectives, bring people from different parts of the organization together, so you're getting all the different pieces to make sense of what's going on. Organizing in small segments is a good strategy too, where you have smaller groups of folks working together to construct some meaning in a kind of more centralized way, and then they decentralize what they've come up with and spread it out to the rest of the organization. And then again, it becomes an iterative process of meaning making, with more contributors adding to um, the meanings that you're generating through your processes. And then I consider sense making competencies in the hiring process when you're bringing, again, getting back to that jazz band metaphor. You're forming a band, and who do you want to be in that band? And you probably want people who have the capability to sense make enough so that they can manage up and get the people that are in positions of formal authority to buy into certain uh, programs or products that you and your team have made sense of enough to pitch. You want to make sure that they can emotionally self-regulate. That's a real important feature, because often when you're dealing with ambiguous situations, it can raise people's anxiety and make them frustrated. So look for people who can emotionally self-regulate, have that research mindset, and that part of that again is being having that wariness of having too much confidence in your perspective, having some humility, and looking at things in a nuanced in a nuanced manner. Being a self-starter and having a sense of self-efficacy, like I can get things done, I know how to do it, and then also the ability to influence others are things. So those are some of the characteristics you might look for in a type of person on your team who might be able to contribute to a sense making organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, I don't think we're just, I mean, speaking outside of like who to hire, I mean, I think you've also spoke to some ways to think about running your organization and the processes. And I think it's important. You kind of touched on a couple of them. In that it's important to lean in to these kinds of things. If you approach them with too much reluctance, you will have confirmation bias to show that they are not succeeding or they won't work. You can functionally get in the way of success of trusting the process of these sorts of methods of allowing this sort of jazz band approach to occur. I'm also, and then you also touched on about making sure that there's a leadership story, and then that you get people that are have good skills in this area. I would say even if people don't have good skills in this area, it's important to recognize there's a way to bring people into this fold.
Oh yeah.
There's a training mechanism to get people to feel comfortable in these spaces because you could be in a vulnerable spot. Again, you're coming from a traditional, and this is becoming less and less of a reality, but we're talking about a spectrum here, right? You're not either this or
Right.
that. And if you're leaning towards an area, in your history of your career where it leans more towards a traditional organizational hierarchical structures where your job role is almost more like a heuristic, you know exactly what's expected of you daily, and then you're thrusted into a situation where that's not the case. In fact, what you do at the company is kind of at flux. That can be terrifying, and so have compassion as you're executing on these things, that people will be very uncomfortable, and give them that space to be uncomfortable, but also give them the padding by which they know that this is not a pass fail scenario. This is a learning experience. And every time something doesn't work,
Yes.
that it's not that you failed. You just learned something new, is all. And that's important in these scenarios. Tough for a company to do. I mean, when we're talking about bottom line, dollars and cents, like I joined a small company at one point in time years ago where we had $1.5 million in the bank to get us through a year and a half. I mean, you've got these dollars, but
Yeah, and
if you
sense making
don't,
takes time.
it can, and but it's it's also a scary process. It demands that to some degree leadership relinquishes control to some degree, and
Yep.
so when we know that when fear takes over, the desire to control more is what takes over. Right when the car is veering out of control, you grab on that wheel and make sure you're all the pedals and
And that gets
controls.
back to the emotional regulation
Yeah.
aspect, right?
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
you've gotta have you almost have to be a stoic. Uh, you have to have a stoic approach, right? You have to be able to regulate your fears and your anxieties so that they're not driving your decisions. And that's hard because we know, as we've talked again in other podcasts, what are we really rational beings, or are we being really controlled by our subconscious and more emotional reptilian parts of our brain, right? um and so being aware of that, and being able to emotionally self-regulate, and that's true for the people at the top end of the leadership too. And yeah, this is not easy work, and I don't think we're saying it's either easy work,
Mm.
and Veek is probably not trying to say it's easy work. And but it's something to think about. It's a choice for you and your teams to make. And I agree with you, Joda. I think training is part of it, and also creating an environment where people do feel safe to engage in this type of sense making,
Yeah.
where they can feel free to speak their minds freely, make mistakes, say the wrong thing. You know, that has to be there. You know, from a motivational theory point of view, part of motivating people is creating an environment where they feel like they can succeed, where that they self-efficacy is not just coming from some innate place within a person. It's also a product of the environment that they exist within. And if they feel like they're supported by the leadership and by their team members, then they're going to feel more able to take action and participate in sense making activities.
Yeah, and I think that a post-industrial organization, it is, I mean, w- is probably rife with people probably often feeling like they're failing, like they're not doing because they're not sure the traditional goals and outcomes of their job are more ambiguous, and so it's probably rife with that. And so this sense making approach isn't necessarily directly to respond to that, but what it does is it generates it's an outcome of you implementing the systems, or excuse me, the sense making mechanisms, right? That by you implementing, you're saying, hey, we recognize this company as a post-industrial organization, and so we're going to not identify our internal structure as decision making mechanisms, but as meaning making mechanisms. Then that will begat systems that will allow people to be more improvisational, riff off of each other a little more, and then hopefully then generate safe places where people can feel emboldened to take risks and not be necessarily penalized if those risks don't pan out necessarily to the degree that they wanted them to do, to the degree they wanted them. So I guess that's what I'm saying in a long-winded way, is that although it's not necessarily, I don't think, and from what I've read, it's about trying to make people feel comfortable. I think it's an emergent reality that would occur if you did identify, because if you are a post industrial company pretending that you are a pre post or a industrial company, that's probably the worst case scenario, because then you'll have total ambiguity. No one will know what to do. No one's empowered to actually make decisions in the way that they need to in that environment. So recognition of the post industrial organization, and then the implementation of a sense making, those are the two things that are probably quite paramount in this scenario.
Great. I think that is a perfect way to wrap up this conversation, Joda.
I
Congratulations.
killed the conversation. All
I
right,
did.
that's
I
fine.
did. No. I think you put the fine point on the end of the conversation. And yeah,
Maybe.
I agree. I mean, and just as a thread, maybe to pick up on, as a leader, modeling this kind of behavior, the sense making approach, and also providing training and coaching to make people thrive in that kind of environment, really important. So if you again, this is the Sense and Signal podcast with Joda and Dan, and if you liked listening to us explore this conversation and or this topic, and uh, please hit the like button, subscribe, follow us if you're on Apple. I hear most of our folks are following us on Apple, so or listening to us on Apple, so podcast. So yeah, follow, like, and subscribe, and we'll be back next week with another scintillating conversation that'll be picked by
Scintillating.
Joda.
Oh,
Do you know what we're going to talk about next week, Joda?
we are going to talk about, I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Well, there you go, folks. Have a great day.
Bye.
He loves doing that.